I want to make sure to emphasize some of the other considerations when planning an experiment, because these are really important things that if you were planning your own experiment, you should include, but more importantly, when you're evaluating the results from an experiment, that you look for these principles to make sure that the results are actually good. The goal of an experimental design is to provide a method for collecting data that, one, minimizes sources of variability in the response. And we want to do that so that any differences in the response we know are due to the experimental conditions and not some other source of variability. And then two, we want to create experimental groups that are similar with respect to potential confounding variables that cannot be controlled. A few other things to consider when planning an experiment is to use what's called a control group. Now, you won't always have a control group, but if the purpose of an experiment is to determine whether some treatment has an effect, then it would be important to include an experimental group that does not receive any treatment. That would be the definition of a control group. What it does is it allows the experimenter to assess how the response variable behaves when the treatment is not used. This is going to provide a baseline so that you can compare your treatment groups to some control group where there was no treatment. Now, a little note here with control groups, we do have to be aware that we would never want to harm an individual. So if we were trying to look at a new drug for, say, cholesterol, well, we would want the control group to be whatever the current standard is for controlling cholesterol. That would be the no treatment because it's the current accepted treatment. Then our experimental groups would be new drugs that we might be testing. So a control group, even though by definition it's this idea of no treatment, it essentially provides a baseline treatment to whatever we would do if we weren't changing anything in our patients. Another thing to consider is that humans were fallible. And sometimes humans believe that just because they're receiving some treatment that they're going to improve. So we often will incorporate a placebo into human studies, and that's where our control group, even though they're not receiving a treatment, they are receiving what appears to be a treatment. So they are receiving maybe a pill. It just doesn't have any active ingredients. Or they may be receiving some sort of intervention, but it's not actually the intervention that we're trying to test. We have to remember that people sometimes respond just to the power of suggestion. Another similar issue with humans is that sometimes we see what we want to see. And so we will often employ this idea of blinding. And what that means is that you just don't know what treatment has been assigned. So we need to consider that because sometimes people have their own beliefs about how effective they think certain treatments are going to be. So often we would either not let the participants know what treatment they were getting, or we would not let the experimenter know what treatment was being administered, or maybe we would not let either group know. So if we've just hidden the type of treatment from one, either the subjects or the experimenter, that is single blind. But if we've hidden the type of treatment from both, then that would be considered double blind. Also, we need to be aware that using volunteers as subjects in an experiment can sometimes be problematic. We learned in an earlier section that when sampling, a voluntary response sample is very rarely appropriate. But in terms of experiments, it's not quite as terrible because we often have to rely on volunteers in order to participate in these experiments. We can't just go and find somebody and say, hey, you have to participate in this experiment. So people will volunteer to participate. This does limit the ability to generalize to a larger population, but as long as you use random assignment, of the volunteers to the different treatments, then you still should be able to compare the groups, and so you still should be able to address whether or not there's a treatment effect.